Hi everyone! I'm here to do my January reading wrap up. It is February 1st, 2022, and so I thought I would just film this little ditty to talk about everything I read in January. So let's just dive right in. I don't even recall how many books I read this month. Maybe 9? We'll find out. We'll just get through it and we'll find out. So let's start off with my first book that I read in 2022, and that was Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I had only read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, and I had never read her fiction. So I knew that I'd wanted to read her fiction, and I actually had this book for forever. I have a disgusting TBR, physical TBR, that I don't even want to share it with you all because it's so embarrassing. So there's so many books that I've had for maybe years that I haven't read, so we don't need to talk about that. It's fine. And this was one of them, and so I finally picked it up, and wow, I was blown away by Virginia Woolf's stream of consciousness style writing. I thought the way that she weaved this narrative about a woman's life, and sort of a woman who seems like she's not very important. You know, she's basically a housewife in 1920s London. I mean, a wealthy housewife, but still doesn't really have a lot of purpose, so to say, in society. And I think that there's so much meaning in how Virginia Woolf focused so much on Mrs. Dalloway as a character, and then how she also weaved in these other characters as well. Is it Septimus? I can't pronounce his name, but that's sort of the other kind of parallel narrative that happens in this book. And so if you don't know what Mrs. Dalloway is about, as I said, it follows a basically wealthy housewife in 1920s London over the course of a day, and she's going to throw a party in the evening. And at the same time, there's kind of an interweaving narrative of this World War I veteran named Septimus. And he's sort of this, I think he's sort of the dark side that Virginia Woolf wrote in to try and sort of bring out these different varying forces in the world, the light and the dark. And he is a World War I veteran who suffers from extremely strong PTSD, or what they called at the time was shell shock. And it's a really interesting, also I think, argument of class too, in kind of what happens in the plot of the book. And also Virginia Woolf kind of wrote Mrs. Dalloway in a way as looking at these fleeting moments, right? She talks about a flame in a lit match in a crocus flower, and that's just one narrative or one part of the story that I couldn't really stop thinking about. And she also plays really well with this idea of what we see is not everything, and it gets a little I don't know, maybe even a little psychedelic. I think Mrs. Dalloway is, because she talks a lot about how you see the concrete, or you see the street, and the street used to be dirt, and the street used to be a forest, and all these time is just sort of compounds into all happening at the same time. And it gets really interesting the way I think that she deals with time in this book. And time is a big part, in that Big Ben is a figure in the story. And in fact, the original draft of this book was called The Hours. And I think it really is just talking about life in its most minuscule form, which is just moment to moment to moment to moment, sort of just how time passes and what we do in that time in our consciousness. So loved this book. I gave it a 5 out of 5. Okay, so this was a Christmas present to myself. I got this beautiful annotated version of Mrs. Dalloway, and I kind of read them side by side so you could get different kind of historical background of what was happening. And it was just, had all this background information on London in the 1920s, and I learned a lot about kind of the political and cultural aspects of Mrs. Dalloway. And it's just really, really well done. So I highly recommend, if you want to read Mrs. Dalloway, to maybe like have this alongside. I mean, it's the text itself. You could just read it in this form if you wanted to. Like, here is the, like, this is the actual text of the book, and then all the annotations are on the side. So it's kind of fun. It's like reading a novel that's also a picture book. I was like, yes, thank you very much. I love that. So that was a huge, wonderful, beautiful thing that I discovered this month, and I read, and I had so much fun exploring. So on that note, this wasn't the next book I read, but just to stick with the theme, I read The Hours by Michael Cunningham. So if you don't know what The Hours is Michael Cunningham's sort of retelling of Mrs. Dalloway, and it was published in the late 90s, maybe the year 2000, I'm not sure. And it's his sort of exploration of all the different facets of Mrs. Dalloway told through 3 different kind of reiterations of her, if that makes sense. We have Virginia Woolf herself as one of the characters, a woman named Laura Brown, who is a housewife in the 1950s, and then Clarissa Vaughn, who is a book editor, also a lesbian in the 1990s in New York City, living through kind of the aftermath of the AIDS crisis in her community. And I really like how he weaved in with the Septimus character. There wasn't really a specific, there was a Septimus character in The Hours, but it was very interesting how he did it, and he really used the AIDS crisis as sort of that backdrop as opposed to World War I. Yeah, I thought this was well written, not as good as Mrs. Dalloway, like not even close, I think, but it was really fun to read after reading Mrs. Dalloway and kind of seeing the inner weavings of it. And I really also liked the Laura Brown character. If you're interested in narratives of kind of wives who leave, bad mother vibes, or we're using the term bad in quotes here, then I would read this because the Laura Brown character and its exploration of motherhood I thought was really fascinating and introspective. So yeah, I would definitely recommend giving The Hours a read. I very much enjoyed reading this, and then of course watching the movie. As we know, our girl Meryl is in it. I also think it's very meta because in this book, Clarissa Vaughn, who Meryl Streep plays in the movie, in the book, Clarissa Vaughn is walking through New York. She sees a movie set, and she's wondering who the main actress is. And in the book, they're like, maybe it's Meryl Streep, and it's really funny because you're reading it and you're like, you're gonna be played by Meryl Streep. It's very interesting. So, yeah. We love The Hours. We love Mrs. Dalloway. That was my little Virginia Woolf theme that I had reading this early this month. And then I read All the Birds Singing by Evie Wyld. This was my first Evie Wyld I read. I believe I picked this book up at a used bookstore in Oakland, California, Walden Pond Books, when I was there in September. So here we are, learning things that have been on my TBR for a long time. And I was very much enthralled by the description on the back, which talks about a woman living on a remote farmhouse on a craggy British Isle. And I was like, yeah, let's go. That sounds good. And I liked this book. It was okay. It didn't blow my mind, but it definitely had some thrillery vibes. It follows this woman who is sort of escaping. You don't really know what she's escaping, but she's escaping something, living on this remote island and working on a sheep farm. And it's sort of, she starts to unravel, and that she thinks that something is out there killing her sheep, and she's not sure what it is. And that's kind of the premise that you're working with most of the time. I will say at the end, it felt rushed, like a lot got revealed at the end that felt very like all of a sudden. And it was sort of like, I felt like it could have been more carefully crafted into the book earlier. And I would say don't read this book if you have to have neat endings, because this book does not have a neat ending. You're not going to walk away from reading this book being like, I know exactly what happened. Like, that's not how this book was written. So yeah, it was still like kind of moody. I liked the setting, so that was why I picked this book up and why I liked it. So yeah, that was All the Birds Singing. And then next, I listened to Call Me By Your Name on audio, and that was so beautiful. I had only ever seen the film, and I had seen the film multiple times. It's actually one of my favorite films. I love Timothée Chalamet in that film. I love the scenery, and I love the dad, like so much about that film, and the music, like everything about it. I've loved since it came out. Probably seen it 3 or 4 times, and I can't believe I've never read the book. And what's so cool about the book is that it follows Elio. So you're inside Elio's head, and in the movie you really don't get that. And so if you don't know, Call Me By Your Name is a book about Elio, who lives with his parents who are academics in their villa in Italy, and every summer they host a researcher. And this summer they are hosting an American named Oliver, and it's sort of about how they are discovering their sexuality and sort of a will they, won't they for a little bit. But it's really I'm realizing after reading it, it's a coming of age story for Elio. And there's so much in here that you're reading inside his mind, where he is trying to learn his sexuality, who he is, what he wants. There's a lot in here about desire, and I thought it was gorgeous and beautifully written. And this is actually my friend's copy, because I was just listening to it on audio, and I was like, I want the print because I need to like actually read some of these things that have been said. And so they gave this to me to borrow, and it's just a gorgeous, gorgeous book. I know that there's a sequel. I can't remember the name of it right now, but I'll put it right here. And that's definitely on my TBR. And I know they're making a movie of the sequel. So yeah, also it's steamy. So yeah, you gotta love that. Yeah, I just absolutely adored this book. Okay, and then we're gonna have a couple, now we're getting into our section of the month where I had a little bit of a slump. And that was me reading Unsettled Ground by Claire Fuller. I read Unsettled Ground sort of like, I was just reading it as something to read. I got it from the library. Again, I liked the British setting, this idea of 2 siblings living in this cottage and a farm where everything's sort of unraveling around them. I will say that I read it pretty uncritically for like maybe the first half. I was just sort of reading it to read it. And then I kind of realized after the first half that I was not really enjoying it, and I wasn't really invested in the characters, and it just wasn't hitting for me. And so Unsettled Ground is a book about 2 siblings who have to deal with a family tragedy that happens pretty much at the beginning of the book, where their mother dies. And they are kind of like Arrested Development kids, in that they've never left the house. One of the children, the daughter, they're in their 50s, and she's never learned to read or write. And I think this sounds hard, but when I was reading it, I had a really hard time like imagining these characters in real life. I was sort of like, you know, one of them, the daughter who was 50, had never used a cell phone, and it was set in sort of modern-ish times. So I just had a hard time believing that she had never used a cell phone and that she couldn't read or write. I just didn't really believe that these characters were who they were. And so I had a hard time with that, I think. And so it's just them basically having to learn to be on their own once their mother dies. And yeah, I had maybe about 50 pages left, maybe even 30 pages. Like, that's how much I didn't care, because I had 30 pages left and I just stopped because I was like, I don't like this book. I don't want to read about this book. I don't care what happens to these characters. Like, I just didn't care. And so that's sort of, with a character-based book like that, which I really think that book was supposed to be about, that sibling relationship, this sort of coming of age when you're already of age book. Didn't really work for me if I'm not invested in the characters. So Unsettled Ground was a no. I wouldn't really necessarily suggest it to people, but I've heard so many people loved it, and it's been like some people's favorite book ever. So, you know, everyone has different things that they're into. Another womp womp this month was Wolf Hall. And not because I don't think it's going to be a good read, but I tried listening to it on audio, and I probably listened to like the first 2 hours of the book on audio, and I just literally wanted to stab the audio narrator like in the throat. I was like, why must you speak this way? The way he did the Chancellor's voice, was it the Chancellor? I believe it was the Chancellor. The way he did the Chancellor's voice like made, like, it sounded like nails on a chalkboard. I'm surprised I even got through 2 hours. So I was frustrated because I was hoping that that would be a good book to read over while I drive to work, and it would just ended up being a bust. So I still have Wolf Hall on my TBR. I actually have the physical book here. I just, I do not want to listen to the audio. I don't know if anyone else feels me, but like, I'm so picky about my audiobook narrators. If they get too theatrical, or like, I don't know, I just really don't like it. So yeah, that was a no. But then after that, when I was kind of in this little slump, and it was for about like a week, I was unsure of, like, it's just so frustrating to me sometimes when I pick up a book and I don't like it, because there's so many things I want to read, but I have to just know that it's part of the process. So then I picked up A History of My Brief Body by Billy Ray Belcourt, which is a book of nonfiction / memoir. Billy Ray Belcourt is an Indigenous author from Canada, and this book explored queerness, colonization, very much like what it means to be alive and in this modern world when so much of your history is based in this like shared grief and trauma. I really loved this book. Had some just beautiful sort of segments on gender and queerness, as well as just very frank kind of discussions on colonialism, especially in sort of literary spaces and academia. So I really enjoyed this book, and I heard about it from Literary Iggy. So thanks, Iggy. It was a wonderful read, and I'm really grateful for your recommendation. And then I read Vanishing Twins by Leah Dieterich, and I feel like that's kind of been going around. I feel like maybe CJ Reads was one of the first people I heard talk about this book, but this is also a memoir, also a queer memoir of a woman who is married to her husband, and they sort of decide that they want to open up their marriage, and she decides she wants to explore her sexuality and be poly for a little bit. And it also goes deeper than that, in that the narrator has always had this idea that she feels like she has a twin that died in the womb before she was born, and she's always searching for that twin, that person that's going to reflect back herself to her, which I thought was a really unique way to look at relationships. Now, as far as the text itself, it was written very in like short fragments, so it was like a quick read. It didn't blow me away, and at the end of it, I don't know, I think I remember Rebecca Eats' book said something like, read it if you want to see a happy couple have an existential crisis about their relationship. And it did sort of feel that way at times, where it was like they were causing more drama than they needed, or that, you know, I just kept noticing but I think that's what the book is about. It's like a frank and honest look at a couple opening up their marriage and what that looks like. And I think that's just what it was, and it is what it is. Yeah, so that was Vanishing Twins. I definitely say read it if you're interested in that kind of subject and want to learn more, because it was, definitely something that I found interesting. Okay, and then I read As Long as the Grass Grows by Dina Gilio-Whitaker. This was a book that I read for work. It's something really cool that they do every January, where they host a diversity book group, and it's for faculty, staff, and students. And I volunteered to be a facilitator of the book group. So I read that kind of slowly over this month, and it was really fun to be able to talk about it with students and staff and other faculty. It's a really great introduction into learning about the history of Indigenous environmental justice movement. It goes into the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone Pipeline, talks a lot about food justice. I learned a lot about like uranium mining, like a lot of history that I didn't know. And it was just really well written and accessible. It is sort of an academic text, but it's definitely not written in such a way that it's not accessible to read. So I definitely recommend that. It inspired me to read Braiding Sweetgrass, which is also a book that I own that I haven't read yet, because I think I've heard it so amazing, and I don't know, I'm just like want to read it at the right time, but I'm feeling that the right time might be soon. So yeah, that was As Long as the Grass Grows. And then I'm realizing I forgot a book that I read earlier in the month. It wasn't the last book I read this month, but I read Writers and Lovers by Lily King, which I really liked. It was such a sweet book. And I know there's been a lot of conversation kind of on maybe BookTube. I know that CJ Reads and the Bar in the Bookcase did a great podcast about about trauma plot. And which, if you don't know what trauma plot is, it's sort of where the whole plot around the character is that they are recovering from some sort of trauma event. And Writers and Lovers kind of explores that, but I thought it was different in that it really, I think, just honestly showed someone who is dealing with grief, because the book is about a young woman. She's maybe 30, 31, who has been trying to be a writer basically since after college, and is struggling through that, and her mother has just died. And so it's her working at a restaurant in Boston while she's like renting this garage. She barely has any money, and she's trying to finish her first novel, all while dealing with the grief of her mother and while falling in love with people on the way. So it was a very beautifully like crafted book. I really liked the main character, and I think that I also liked the kind of restaurant setting, and working in the back of house and that sort of thing, and like the relationships that you form there. And I think what this book, because this book is definitely something where she's kind of going back and looking at past trauma in her life. But I thought what was so different is that at the end, she really overcomes a lot, and it kind of has like an actual happy ending, and that's kind of like conclusive and sweet. And I feel like that's so rare with so many of the books in the literary fiction world nowadays, where the ending is either you have no idea what you just read, or it ends very depressingly, or it ends in a way where you're like unsure what actually happened. So it was really nice and just very like sweet. And yeah, Lily King, I really loved Euphoria. It was one of my top books that I read last year. So yeah, I really enjoyed Writers and Lovers. Yeah. Okay, so then I guess what's up next as far as what I'm reading to begin February? Well, I've actually been reading Sorrow and Bliss for like the last week. I've kind of had a slow reading week. I'm almost done, but I don't want to like review it and say what I think, because I don't know what's going to happen. And that might determine, actually, with this book, depending on where this is going, I might like it or not like it. So yeah, right now I'm reading Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, and yeah, so far my favorite thing about it is the relationship between the sisters is my favorite part of this book. And then I'm also listening to on audio Hidden Valley Road, which I am loving. It's been a while since I found a good nonfiction audiobook that I have loved listening to, and it follows this family through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. A family of 12 kids, and 6 out of the 12 kids are diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so it sort of follows their story, and in the backstory, like the movement and research of the illness over time. So really like that book so far. I was like a psych emphasis in college, so it's like I find all that stuff super interesting. Yeah, so that's what I'm reading. I have some cool books that I'm hoping to read this month. I always have so many library holds. I'm like a total hoe for the library. You heard it here first, folks. She's a library hoe. Yeah, so thanks for listening to my January wrap up. I'll probably do more vlogs. I think I really like doing vlogs. I'm going to California this weekend, so I'm gonna get some sunshine. It's gonna be amazing. Yeah, and thanks for listening, and I hope you have a glorious, wonderful day. Bye.